All right, congratulations again. My name is Rebecca Tinder. I'm the West Virginia We the People Coordinator and your facilitator for Unit 4. Our judges have not all, have now all arrived, and they will introduce themselves, and the students will introduce themselves and their teacher, and then we shall begin.
Hello, folks. I'm Hank Chambers, law professor, University of Richmond. I saw you all a couple days ago. Good to see you again. With luck, we'll have another good conversation. And here we go.
Yeah, my name is Joe Stewart. I know I'm still employed at Clemson University because I'm in my office today, so they let me in. But good to see you again. We look forward to having more of a discussion with you today.
And hello, Washington. It's nice to see you and join these colleagues who you've had an opportunity to meet with previously. I'm looking forward to your conversation today. My name is Lynn Simons, and I'm the Chief Judge of the Second Judicial District Court in the state of Nevada. And I know that before a lot of nerve-wracking events, one of the best things you can do is take a deep breath. So I'd like to ask you to do that now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is yoga pose. Feel free, but go ahead and introduce yourselves in your turn.
Of course. Hello, my name is John Greniel, and my favorite governor is Tom Wolf of Pennsylvania for signing of House Bill 1175, which placed severe limitations on corporate lobbying in the state legislature.
Hello, my name is Annalee Scholey. My favorite governor is South Dakota's Christine Noem for her work under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, as well as her adherence to individual liberties.
Hello, my name is Jonah Wiggins, and my favorite governor is Ron DeSantis of Florida for his fierce defense of civil liberties, as well as his stringent adherence to his moral values. On behalf of Unit 4, our advisor Gretchen Wolfen, Tahoma High School, and Washington State, we'd like to thank you for judging us today.
Thank you so much. We're doing Unit 4, Question 2. So let me read that, and then we'll go from there. The president ought to communicate such papers as the public good would permit, and ought to refuse those the disclosure of which would injure the public. Do you agree or disagree that the executive can withhold or disclose information at her or his discretion? To what extent, if any, has the claim of executive privilege expanded presidential power since its inception? Are the constitutional powers that enable the other two branches to counter executive privilege claims sufficient? Why or why not? We're ready for your opening.
Executive privilege is an extraordinary assertion of power, not to be lightly invoked. Justice Anthony Kennedy.
We disagree that the executive may withhold or disclose information at their discretion because the courts possess the ability to check this power.
The executive privilege derives from the royal prerogative, which is a common law power the British monarch could invoke as a means to withhold information from Parliament as they saw fit.
In the 1611 case of proclamations, Sir Edward Coke attempted to evade accountability to Parliament and rule by invoking this prerogative. And common law courts ruled that while the Crown did have the authority to use this power, the courts also had a say in the limitations imposed on.
Since executive privilege drew inspiration from this common law authority, it can also be limited by the courts. Nevertheless, the executive requires this power to preserve its efficiency.
Such a need is exemplified in Memoranda on Consultations with the President. In this memo, Jefferson remarks that in regards to the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, former President Washington did not like throwing too much into Democratic hands.
This asserted that his claim of executive privilege was in the interest of keeping the treaty-making process privileged from the House, which is not constitutionally involved, and preserving executive function.
Thus, while the courts have rightfully checked this power over time, it is nevertheless necessary to maintain the efficacy of the executive.
The claim of executive privilege has inappropriately expanded presidential power over time by enabling the executive to evade accountability to the other branches of government.
In 1833, President Jackson utilized executive privilege during the bank war to prevent Senator Clay from subpoenaing statements he made regarding the withdrawal of federal bank deposits that would cause the end of the Second National Bank.
It set the precedent that privilege could be used to block legislative investigations that the president disapproves of.
President Nixon utilized a similar approach in the Watergate scandal, in which he spied on and sabotaged political opponents.
When evidence of Nixon's crimes led to a congressional investigation, the president invoked the power of executive privilege in an attempt to protect himself. The courts, however, denied this claim, And in the 1974 case of US v. Nixon, a new precedent was set that criminal activity cannot be hidden from Congress via executive privilege.
Nevertheless, the 2022 court ruling in United States v. Zabeta demonstrated the still existing defensive capabilities of executive privilege when the court ruled in favor of a privilege claim on a suit by an alleged former Al-Qaeda member regarding his torture in a Poland CIA facility.
In his dissent, Justice Gorsuch argued that an executive interest in protecting secrets does not extend to quashing suits that Congress has authorized the judiciary to entertain.
This demonstrates how the president has abused executive privilege to halt suits authorized by other branches, and how executive privilege has gradually eroded executive accountability to the legislature.
While the legislative branch lacks sufficient constitutional authority to counter claims of executive privilege, the judicial branch has such power but does not use it adequately.
The legislature's main counter to claims of executive privilege is its contempt power, established under the congressional authority to set its own rules in Article 1, Section 5, Clause 2.
However, this power has been proven to be insufficient in the face of executive privilege due to the reliance on the Department of Justice.
In 2020, after President Trump attempted to place a citizenship question on the census, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and Attorney General Bill Barr were both held in contempt of Congress. However, the DOJ refused to prosecute, preventing further action from being taken.
Their other option is filing a civil suit and deferring enforcement to the judicial branch, which has the power to hear all cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution through Article 3, Section 1, Clause 1.
However, this power is not used effectively, and the courts often avoid substantive rulings pertaining to executive privilege due to separation of powers.
For example, in the 2022 ruling of Trump v. Thompson, which concerned Trump's invocation of executive privilege out of office, the Supreme Court had relied on previous tests rather than answering the substantive issue they should have.
It is critical that the judiciary combat the increasing scope of executive privilege more proactively in order to ensure the executive is held accountable to the other branches of government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Question, can the president do his or her job without executive privilege?
I strongly believe that the president does have the capacity to do his or her job without the power of executive privilege, and this was exemplified in the case of former President Reagan in the midst of the Iran-Contra affair, in which Reagan had every right to invoke the power of executive privilege and withhold privileged information regarding the diversion of funds to the Contra group in Nicaragua. However, he refused to do so in the name of being honest and open with Congress and preserving presidential integrity.
I agree with my colleague Jonah. In the 1807 case of United States v. Burr, it was demonstrated that executive privilege is generally invoked in times of national crises, since this case concerned Aaron Burr's treason against the United States and the subsequent request for information from former President Jefferson. However, as current President Biden has demonstrated, in the face of one of the greatest national security crises that the country has experienced in the last decade, the Russo-Ukraine war, Biden has been incredibly open about sanctions he is willing to impose over the nation of Russia, as well as military aid that he is sending to Ukraine, demonstrating how the executive is absolutely capable of doing their job, even without executive privilege.
I would like to agree with both of my colleagues. I believe that it is possible for the president to successfully do his job without invoking executive privilege, such as my colleague Jonah mentioned about Reagan's lack thereof use of executive privilege, as well as the Bush administration, who both stringently did not like the use of executive privilege and rarely, if ever, used it.
So should we just eliminate executive privilege?
I do not believe that we should eliminate executive privilege because, as Madison stated in Federalist 48, the separation of powers is very important to the efficacy of the executive.
Furthermore, in Federalist 72, Alexander Hamilton argues for a greater degree of independence in the magistrate, which asserts his idea that a certain degree of secrecy in the executive is necessary to preserve public contentment and allow the president to take necessary action needed for the good of the nation without dishonoring their public image.
I disagree with both of my colleagues, and I would agree with Thomas Jefferson, who historically wrote in a 1789 letter to John Adams during the Philadelphia Convention when they were both in France that he despised secrecy in government. As a future voter myself, it worries me that the executive is capable of withholding information from my elected representatives at will simply because they want to protect national security, or as recent presidents such as President Trump have demonstrated, potentially even their own public image, and therefore I believe that it is critical that executive privilege is eliminated because it is not necessary for the separation of powers.
If the defense of executive privilege hinges on secrecy, is that possible today in our times of 24-hour news cycle and social media?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, it sounded to me like the defense of executive privilege was the need for secrecy at times. I'm wondering if that's possible, given that we've got 24-hour news cycles, we've got if people do something or say something, it will be recorded in both audio and video. Doesn't that undermine the idea of secrecy as a rationale for executive privilege?
Well, to a degree, documents can certainly be kept secret even with the current state of the media in the United States. As former President Trump demonstrated, prior to the case of Trump v. Mazars LLP, which ultimately caused President Trump's private accounting firm to have to release his tax returns, Trump was able to keep his tax returns secret from the public prior to this court case, demonstrating how despite the media's ability to investigate on its own and find information on its own, documents can still be kept secret, and in cases where they should be kept secret, the media's existence does not necessarily serve as a way to override executive privilege.
Adding on to my colleague Jack, there's often legislation that needs to be passed in order to bring public attention and visibility into the inner workings of the federal government, as can be seen with the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, which authorized the ability to televise all congressional hearings. So it would likely need to be enforced on a congressional level if there were to be more transparency regarding privileged information being withheld by an executive.
So there's the concept that power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. And you said in your statement that Congress needs to combat abuse more proactively. What are some other ways to combat abuse?
One major way to combat executive privilege, specifically that particular abuse of executive power, can be seen in HR 5314, a bill that recently passed the House of Representatives and is awaiting approval in the Senate. Particularly Title IV, Section 105 creates what is called a privilege log, which is often used in civil litigation. These privilege logs would require the president, in addition to describing why they are claiming executive privilege, which was established in the aforementioned case of U.S. v. Burr, they must also provide a brief summary of what is being privileged. This would enable Congress to have a greater idea of what information specifically the executive is claiming privilege over, and enable them to better construct their investigations to account for this.
Furthermore, in the same bill, in Section 402, it grants Congress the ability to enforce the subpoena power to a greater extent, giving them more power in order to make sure that the president is giving up information that they feel like they need to have in order to conduct an investigation.
Adding on to both of my colleagues, there is a provision in this bill that does not directly relate to the legislative branch, which can be found in Section 403, which actually proposes the idea of a three-panel judiciary system composed of three judges, rather, that would allow certain cases of congressional subpoenas, particularly regarding those dealing with executive privilege, to be fast-tracked to the Supreme Court in order to prevent the gridlock that often comes when the judiciary takes up these complex claims of executive privilege.
So if executive privilege is separation of powers based and constitutionally based, would that suggest that the legislation you just noted might be unconstitutional?
So it is definitely arguable that because the president nominates Supreme Court justices, which, however, they do need to be confirmed by the Senate, there is certainly some room for some degree of ulterior partisan motive in these judicial bodies. However, there are alternative solutions proposed that would allow a more objective oversight of these issues.
Adding on to my colleague, this legislation cannot be seen as unconstitutional simply because the executive privilege, while it has constitutional basis, is nevertheless an inherent power of the executive generally, since it derives from the royal prerogative. We have seen it is analogous to penumbral rights that the citizens possess, such as the right to privacy, which Congress is also able to legislate on through, as we've seen recently with the effort to codify Roe v. Wade, which would place limitations on the right to, or which would expand the right to privacy by enabling abortions nationally. It is very similar, and because Congress can legislate on this penumbral right, it is logical that they can also legislate on executive privilege, which is a similarly loosely constitutionally based power.
Aren't they heavily limited on how they can legislate on fundamental rights?
Congress is limited in some capacity on how they can legislate on fundamental rights. For example, the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights outlines several rights upon which Congress cannot legislate, being freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. And further, these limitations in the Bill of Rights do not only exist on the First Amendment, they also exist on other amendments and prevent Congress from legislating on such fundamental rights as the citizens of the United States possess.
Your solution to fast tracking things to the Supreme Court, why do we need to create a separate a body to do that? Couldn't the Supreme Court with its discretion now fast track claims about executive privilege?
It would be very difficult for the Supreme Court to be able to fast track these documents in order to rule on them, because the Supreme Court has so many cases that they must pick and choose in order to legislate on. And oftentimes cases of executive privilege are taken up by more district courts rather than the Supreme Court.
Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, there's a certain degree of partisanship that is definitely possible in the Supreme Court with regards to executive privilege claims via the process of presidential nominations. And as such, it is imperative that we have a third party to more objectively review these important complex claims of this penumbral power in order to ensure that the president is not allowed to directly overuse their power.
Adding on to my colleague Annalise, presently the Supreme Court is only capable of uptaking approximately 1% of the cases that they are presented with, according to Britannica, and this is partially due to the amount of time that deliberation over a case takes. And so giving the Supreme Court even more privilege or
All righty. Thank you so much. So comments from my colleagues.
Yeah, well, I very much enjoyed our conversation today. I thought it was far-ranging, and I wish we'd had a little bit more time to talk about the concept of executive privilege versus presidential privilege, because you made an important point about the Department of Justice not following up on some things. The idea of fast tracking things through another body, you're exactly right on what the current caseload of the Supreme Court, but we don't have to go too far back in history where the Supreme Court was handling or was issuing about twice as many decisions. Now, I'm not arguing you're wrong about that. Some of us argued that they shouldn't be handling that many cases. But when Warren Burger was Chief Justice, they were handling about twice as many cases. And when William Rehnquist came in, he came in with the express purpose of reducing the number of cases. I wish we'd had more time to explore how partisanship plays a role. Another important concept here. The great news is you did a wonderful job. I am fully confident that you can continue to wrestle with these issues in the future. Thank you. Very good job.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your presentation and question and answer. And I think not only do we have the goal of an energetic executive, you are very energetic Unit 4. And you brought the discussion and some new things, Al-Qaeda, and I agree with that distinction you made about, there are stopping points, whether it's judicial or let's say the DOJ doesn't go forward. The one thing that I would say that I was going to ask, if there was more time, which we could talk all day, you're just fantastic. But even though President Biden has been transparent in some respects, how do you not know that how do you know he's not holding back? How do you know that he isn't exercising the executive privilege or presidential privilege? The bottom line is it's a hindsight application, right? It's later when they don't want to turn something over. And so that was one question I was going to have about it. But I think that your back and forth just shows that this is an evolving privilege, ever changing in modern times. And I think you acknowledged that, and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good conversation, not surprising given what we saw before over the weekend. Lots of good stuff, lots of good ideas, and lots of good discussion. One of the pieces that seemed as though it structured your presentation was, hey, this privilege exists. We're not necessarily thrilled about broad discretion being used, but courts can limit it. That then raises the question, did the courts get it right? So you've got every right to critique whether the courts have gotten it right in your mind in terms of thinking your way through that. We did see some disagreement on whether the executive privilege is necessary. That's always good to see, considering how you all structured your presentation. In the grand scheme of things, you did focus on HR 5314, so I didn't have a choice but to ask you whether it was constitutional, and things got a little interesting there. So good stuff all around. Y'all handled a lot of real tough questions really well, and certainly did a nice job representing Washington. So good work.
Thank you.